of our pre-symposium seminar series for Bias in the Academy. This is a conference, it's an interdisciplinary conference co-sponsored by Laney Graduate School, CNBC, Neuroethics Program, which is what I direct. A lot of other folks too, so many to count. But this is largely a student spearheaded event, so they decided that these pre-seminar symposium series were something they wanted to do to kind of jog the conversation before the symposium started. And then afterwards, the goal is to create a white paper with practical recommendations for the university based on kind of some of the conversations we had here and at the symposium. So we tried to have a diverse set of people, intellectually diverse people, to present their views. And today we have sociologists, actually with a psychology background, right? Chris Martin, and he's going to talk about biased people or biased researchers. And I'll let you, this will run until 4:30. But I wanted to say that we have looks like we have people from all over campus here too. And so remember to be careful of jargon and also to be respectful of people, not to talk over people and things like that, which nobody will do here. But we just want to make sure we have a productive discussion. We have a good sized group for that. So Chris, I'll let you do it.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. And if anybody would like to move to the center, feel free. It's easier to make eye contact with you. It's up to you. So my background, as Karen mentioned, is in social psychology. I did a master's degree at the College of William and Mary from 2010 to 2012. And I came here after that. I'm in sociology now. And bias and prejudice and stereotyping are actually three different areas of research, but they're quite closely connected. And sociologists study them, and psychologists study them as well. To some degree, anthropologists probably study them too. And you could really teach a 15-week course just on this topic. So I'm going to talk a bit about a selective area of research today, starting with the origin of the word stereotype. Stereotype is not an exceptionally old word. The first time it was used in the sense that we use it was by Walter Lippmann, who was the founding editor of the New Republic. And he coined the word around 1922. And he was actually a media critic. He himself won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of times in the 1950s. But in addition to being a journalist, he was a media critic. And he was very critical both of the ways in which the media and in which politicians oversimplified issues. Unfortunately, we live in an era where they don't do that anymore. So he was sort of the Jon Stewart of his day, except a little more serious. And his writing really is wonderful. I recommend reading it. But he talked about this one incident in this book called Public Opinion about the problem of oversimplification. And these are his words. He was describing an incident that happened at a conference of psychology a few years before this. He said there was a hall, it was a Congress of Psychology. Not far from the hall in which the Congress was sitting, there was a public fete with a masked ball. Suddenly, the door of the hall was thrown open, and a clown rushed in, madly pursued by a Negro, revolver in hand. They stopped in the middle of the room fighting. The clown fell, the Negro leapt upon him, fired, and then both rushed out of the hall. The whole incident hardly lasted 20 seconds. The president of the Congress asked those present to write immediately a report, since there was sure to be a judicial inquiry, and 40 reports were sent in. And if those of you who are outside social psychology might be thinking this is a really bizarre incident, and if those of you with a background in social psychology would probably thinking this sounds like a social psychology experiment. And it was indeed a social psychology experiment. It was all staged. And the point was, do people accurately remember things, or do people project cliches or stereotypes onto events? And sure enough, even though these were professors, a vast number of reports were wrong of this brawl. They were actually wrong. And so what Walter Lippmann said is they saw a stereotype of a brawl, they had acquired a set of images, and these flickered before their eyes. So what he's talking about is what psychologists often call top-down processing. We impose our maps onto the world, as opposed to letting the facts of the world come up into our mind and form some kind of coherent whole. And he probably was using the word stereotype because there was a form of printing called stereotype or cliche printing. The two words were more or less synonyms back in the day. It was a method of just creating multiple copies in order to print very quickly if you needed to reprint a book. So it was a press of some kind, and basically what he was saying is we're kind of like a printing press. We impose our beliefs or our cliches upon what we're seeing, and we see the cliches, as opposed to seeing what's actually there. And Gordon Allport was probably the first major psychologist to take the area of stereotyping into the area of psychology. And both Lippmann and Allport pointed out that the world is really far too complicated for one human brain to comprehend. The social world, now we have billions of people. Back then they didn't have billions, they had millions, but you can't get to know every person in the world as an individual in all their complexity. You can barely get to know your family in all their complexity. So learn surprising things about people you know every now and then. And so you have to simplify and you have to categorize to make some sense of this world around you. And one way you do it is by looking at prototypical patterns, or patterns that you discern, and then creating stereotypes out of those. So stereotyping is a functional way of categorizing input because you're just getting far too much input from the social world, more than you can comprehend. And Gordon Allport's theory himself was influential. It's changed a lot since then, but the book itself is still in print. There's an anniversary edition. It was highly influential. And of the research following Allport, people sort of took stereotype research in various ways, but one way they took it was, well, clearly some stereotypes are inaccurate. What motivates that? And what seems to be the primary motivation for inaccurate stereotypes is the fact that people are groupish. People tend to form groups very quickly, and then they tend to adopt the hive mind of the group while having this illusion that they're individuals. The two famous researchers in this area are Henry Tajfel, who developed the minimal group paradigm, where you just divide a group, just get a group of people who are very similar and just arbitrarily divide them into people who are sitting on the left side of the room or the right side of the room. And Muzaffar Sharif, who created a theory called realistic conflict theory. His most famous experiment was at the Robbers Cave State Park, which is in Oklahoma. It's still open, and he took a group of about 20 kids, just divided them arbitrarily into two groups, put them in two separate lodges in the state park. So there was nothing inherently dividing them except for the fact that they were now separated into two lodges that were about a mile apart. And over the course of this week, this group's just naturally, well, each of these groups gave themselves a name. There were the Ramblers and the Eagles, if I remember correctly. And they developed a group identity, and they started to compete over resources. One of them put a flag on the baseball diamond to claim the baseball field for their team. And then they eventually wanted to have this group duel, to fight out their differences. And it sort of shows you that once you define a person as part of the group, the group mind takes over. And even it tends to happen outside awareness, but it takes over. And so what's going on is people are groupish, and we've had a lot of research on what's called social identity theory. Lots and lots of research in that area showing that this tends to happen. And that it really is a motivation because you derive self-esteem from knowing that you belong to your group. And that's a primary motivation for trying to belong and adopting the beliefs within your group. But in order to do that, you tend to elevate your group. So it's actually not so much that you denigrate other groups, it's more you're elevating your own group, thinking of your group as better, and yourself as better as a result. Another motivation is a bias in the way we mathematically calculate things. Now, if you're calculating contingencies, whether something is dependent on something else, in theory, you should have a four-way table in your head. So if you're calculating if infectious diseases are spread by mosquitoes, and you go somewhere and there are a lot of mosquitoes, and there are lots of infectious diseases as well, lots of cases, in theory, what you should do is draw a 4x4 or 2x2 table and say, okay, this is the frequency of places I've been to that have lots of mosquitoes and have lots of illnesses. On the left is the number of places I've been to that have infectious diseases without insects. And then on the right side are the places that I visited with no infectious diseases, how many have mosquitoes and how many didn't. What we actually do is we'll tend to only look at one cell. That becomes really salient and give an illusory correlation. And in the long run, this is adaptive because, first of all, we just live in a world with incomplete information. So we have to jump to conclusions sometime, and if in the long run, the strategy is more adaptive than maladaptive, we tend to adopt it. The problem with stereotypes, or minority stereotypes in particular, is that if people in a minority, they tend to be salient because they stand out by virtue of being in a minority. If there's a group of 40 people and 38 belong to one ethnicity, the 2 people who don't will naturally stand out. And we tend to notice negative things more so than positive things. So if one of the members of the minority happens to do something positive and another happens to do something negative, you're far more likely to remember the negative thing. And so if you think of that 2x2 table instead of infectious diseases and insects, if you think of it as minority-majority versus positive and negative actions, because negative actions and minority actions are salient, the cell that has minority and negative in your head gets filled up really quickly, even if everyone is doing a range of positive and negative things, because that's the intersection of the 2 salient things that you're paying attention to. And so that's another reason. And the third reason is there are real group differences, and we tend to observe them. We tend to observe group differences as they actually change over time. There's a great experiment a set of experiments by Diekman and Eagley. You've probably heard of Alice Eagley. She's one of the most foremost psychologists of gender. And what she did is she took a group of undergraduates, all at her college or within that area, and said, imagine men and women of 1950. What do you think their characteristics were? What do you think their incomes were? What do you think their household duties were? And then another group said, imagine the men and women of 1975. And so forth all the way up to 2050. Her theory was that the stereotypes of men and women of a particular era reflect what we actually know about gender stereotypes and gender roles of that era. And she found that this was indeed the case. People have noticed that gender roles have changed over time. The 5th experiment isn't shown here, but you can see that the non-traditionalism index sort of goes up. We've noticed that when women are more and more going into non-traditional roles, and our stereotypes of what men and women of a particular era reflect our observations of trends. So part of that research, Alice Eagley and Diekman and Eagley's research actually falls in the tradition of social reality, which is sort of a new area of research because for a lot of time people talked about social constructions, and it turns out there's actually a large degree of social reality as well. If you're interested, I recommend this book. I'll talk a bit more about Lee Jussin later. He's a psychologist at Rutgers. And the reason we generally don't like stereotypes, particularly when we're targets of stereotypes, is that they feel inherently unfair because they're generally unlikely to be perfectly accurate for any individual, but they may be somewhat accurate. So people generally don't like to be evaluated before they actually have a chance to exhibit their individual characteristics and be evaluated. So in the United States, you have stereotypes of whites being privileged and blacks being underprivileged, and neither of those is perfectly accurate, and both of those can be overgeneralized and applied in ways that make people feel offended because there are white people who've grown up in families with incomes that are far below the poverty line, and the median black income is much higher than most people think it is, somewhat higher than most people think it is. And so that's one reason they feel unfair. Another reason they feel unfair in America in particular is that people have different self-construals. So when you go, this is generalization, but in more collectivist societies, people tend to have interdependent self-construals. So their very sense of their self encompasses their family, their duties to their family. It's an inherent sense of who they are. I grew up in India myself, and I sort of had a non-traditional childhood because I went to an American school for a while and I came to India. And one of the things I noticed about India was a lot of people chose careers based on what their parents wanted. And they felt like they had a duty to do that. And it didn't make sense to me at the time, but I understand now that essentially if you view yourself as part of a collective family and that is who you are, then you construe yourself that way. In America, which is a more individualistic country, people tend to construe themselves as independent, as choosing their own careers, choosing their own paths in life, and they view they view who they are as a result of those choices. And there was an interesting experiment done by C. and Cherian. Sapna Cherian was at the University of Washington, a social psychologist there. And this experiment stemmed from an article that was, I think, published in Newsweek. So it was published in Newsweek, and It was by Nick Kristof about Asian and high Asian achievement in academia in particular, as well as higher Asian incomes. And overall, it was a positive depiction of Asians, but a lot of Asians wrote in, Asian Americans, that is, wrote in and complained about this article as unfairly stereotyping. And this is counterintuitive because something positive is usually taken as a compliment. And so they did some research on what mediates that effect. What is the mechanism that causes even positive stereotypes to be offensive? And one of the mechanisms is this difference between self-construal. Asians who construe themselves very interdependently were less offended, whereas, if given the same article, whereas Asians who construe themselves independently tend to be very offended because they view their identity as individuals. So in America in particular, as well, stereotypes tend to be somewhat offensive. And finally, stereotypes can be offensive because they create this atmosphere of threat. If you belong to a group like young black males that stereotyped as offensive, you realize that there's this atmosphere wherever you go, well, in urban areas in particular, that you're carrying this atmosphere of threat around you. So Claude Steele has done a lot of research in this about the social reality created by stereotypes and how when we envision that other people have stereotypes in their minds, it affects our behavior because those stereotypes are then in the air. And the reason this book is called Whistling Vivaldi is it comes from a story about a New York Times reporter named Brent Staples, who was at the University of Chicago earlier on in his career. And Brent would when he was walking around, he would notice that couples, if they were walking by him on the sidewalk, would just huddle together closer to each other. The people would cross the street sometimes. And he realized that he was being perceived as threatening, even though he as an individual was not threatening. And what he did was to create a different stereotype. So what he did was whenever he walked around, he realized he could whistle pretty well. And so what he did was whenever he'd walk around, he would whistle things like Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, themes from The Four Seasons, or other pieces of classical music, or Beatles songs, things that sort of indicate that you're a cultured person. And so instead of viewing him through the dangerous black male stereotype, people viewed him through the sort of cultured person stereotype and no longer perceived him as threatening. And so it's interesting how you can actually alter the social reality around you given certain manipulations of that social reality. And Claude Steele was actually at Emory last year. I don't know if any of you were at his talk, but he gave a very good talk. And one thing we know, we'll probably hear more about this at the symposium itself because Greg Walton is coming here, but stereotype threat only tends to happen when the stereotype threat in academia, I'll talk a bit about this later, only happens when identities are primed. So there was an interesting article too, because there's the downside to this, of what if people are insufficiently stereotyping, because that's another side of it. And one of the fads in social psychology from about 2010 was the implicit association test. There was an article in around 2000, I believe, by Arles and Tetlock. You may have heard of Philip Tetlock from his more recent studies about political judgment and how a lot of political op-ed writers really have very poor predictions about what is actually going to happen in the political world, but aren't held accountable for it. It's the foxes and hedgehogs theory. Anyway, he wrote an article called "Would Jesse Jackson Fail the Implicit Association Test?" Because Jesse Jackson, in an interview, I believe, said, "There's nothing more painful to me at this stage in my life than to walk down the street and hear footsteps and start thinking about robbery, then look around and see somebody white and feel relieved." And this article was actually published in Psychological Inquiry, which is one of two psychological journals in which an entire issue is devoted to one topic. So there's a target article, and then there's a set of responses. In Psychological Inquiry, there are usually about 3 or 4 responses. In Brain and Behavioral Sciences, there's about 500. So not actually about 50, but you get the point. So Psychological Inquiry is actually a little more interesting to read because you don't feel overwhelmed by the number of responses. And he actually got, so one of the responses, which was by William von Hippel, who's at the University of New South Wales, who teaches psychology classes about the psychology of prejudice. Recall this incident. There was an incident involving one of my students in a course on prejudice. After class one day, she went to withdraw cash, but became nervous when a group of young black men was hanging around the ATM. Remembering my exhortations from lecture, she decided to be, quote unquote, unbiased and withdrew her money, at which point she was robbed. I asked her to describe the men who were hanging out by the ATM, and then asked her if she would have withdrawn the money if they were white. She said she would not, so I suggested that these individuating cues were the relevant data that should have influenced her behavior. The fact that the men had black skin was far less predictive of their probability of taking her money than the fact that they dressed and acted like thugs. So you see the duality here. The point of this larger response was simply acting the opposite of what seems to be biased is not necessarily the answer either. It's just knowing what cues you should be paying attention to in any given circumstance. So when it comes to stereotypes in academia in particular, we know that stereotypes have costs. There's been so much research on stereotypes that there's actually an entire book about it now, if you're really interested in it. But stereotype threat occurs when a salient stereotype about negative performance by your group comes to mind. So if it's salient to you, it causes you stress. If you're black and you're aware of the stereotype that blacks are less intelligent and your black identity is primed, for example, before you take the test, if you fill out a form with your race on it, your identity is primed. And if the test is called an intelligence test, that stereotype is then primed. If you're white and you're asked to play a test of your golfing skills, and it's clearly defined as a test of athletic ability, the stereotype that whites are less athletic than blacks comes to mind, and your performance suffers because of that. If you're Asian and female and you're taking the test and your Asian identity is primed, you tend to do a little better than you would. If your female identity is primed and it's a math test, you tend to do a little worse than you would. So you know these identities are sort of in the psychological atmosphere around you, and they cause stress. And the best model we have right now, they cause stress through two pathways. One is there's an inherent physiological stress response, which taxes some of your mental resources. Because of the anxiety caused by the stress, you have less mental bandwidth, essentially, to cope with the test itself. The other mechanism is through monitoring processes, essentially what we call choking during a performance, where you're so worried about the fact that you're going to make a mistake that you choke and you actually make a mistake. And there are now efforts. What's unusual about this field is the research hasn't quite translated to the field. A lot of the experimental research found larger effects than actual field research. But we know there is an effect. So one thing we know now, Greg Walton will probably talk a bit more about this, is that it's important to figure out if you're priming an identity and artificially deflating scores on academic tests. Another thing we know is that there's this model of shifting standards. Monica Biernat is the leading researcher in this area and has done a ton of research. And you judge people on different scales, and this tends to happen in whenever performance is evaluated. And in academia, because you have exams, performance is evaluated quite frequently. And if you have shifting standards, what that means is you're evaluating men on one standard and women on another, or members of one race on one standard and members of another. Biernat's research tends to be particularly focused on men and women. And I don't know if you're a woman, you probably, because this is the 21st century, this occurs less, but you might have heard a remark like, this performance is pretty good for a woman. Or if you're a man and you're stereotypically female field, you might hear this is pretty good for a man. So her theory is that we do have an absolute scale in our heads if you think of grades, but we also have relative scales. So if a woman gets a C minus, but your whole standard of women is that they're lower performers, they're likely to say something like, this is a pretty good grade for a woman. And the downside is that's actually insulting, but it also means that your overall standard is still low enough that you think of it as good, but you also think of it as an outlier. So in this case, for a woman to be perceived as very competent, she has to repeatedly perform at the very high end of her scale. So because of the lower standard, we have higher people set a higher bar for what counts as consistent high performance among females in a domain that's stereotyped as a stereotypically male domain. So there's sort of this double whammy effect. And finally, we know that there's a role incongruity problem, which is that it's not so much that with the genders in particular, we don't really view one gender as inferior to the other, but we view certain roles as congruent with a certain gender and some roles as congruent with the other gender. And if you look at leadership abilities, what Alice Eagley refers to as one of her most underappreciated or misreported articles is this article she wrote for Psychological Bulletin called Gender and the Effectiveness of Leaders. She did a meta-analysis of lots of studies on leaders and their effectiveness, and what often got caught in media reports was the aggregate effect was 0. And this was a misreporting of what happened because the aggregate report was an average of 2 polls. What she found was there was a congruity effect where men who were leaders in a stereotypically male field, like the military, were rated as more highly effective, and women who were in highly stereotypical roles in occupations that were stereotypically female, like teaching, were rated as highly effective. And they averaged out to 0, but essentially if you violate what seems congruent, or what society holds to be congruent, the fact that you're violating your role causes you to be perceived as less effective. In academia, we know that, for example, in medicine, nursing is somewhat stereotypically female, and medicine is slightly stereotypically male, and there are various gender stereotypes now. Some fields are changing more rapidly than others, but you probably find that effect in academia as well. And finally, this is very new research. A very, very large sample size, actually, over 6,000. It's an audit study on in-group favoritism. Milkman, who's at Columbia University, sent out about, well, if their sample was 6,000, so about 6,000 emails to professors around the country. And they were fake, but it was an audit. And the emails, in one version said, hello, I'm a student. I happen to be in your town this week, and I'd like to apply to your graduate program. Do you have time to meet with me today? And the other version, they said, hi, I'm a student. I happen to be in your city. I'd like to meet with you this Friday. They were sent on a Monday, so a 5-day delay. And the emails were signed with different names. So in some versions, they were signed with a stereotypically Asian male name, some Asian females. Actually, it was divided, so there were Indian males, Indian females, Chinese females, and so forth. And they found out was, if you actually have a request for later in the week, for Fridays, there is a Caucasian male effect. So if you look at the upper left, if you have more time to think about it, both in terms of actually responding to the email and granting them the request for an interview, Caucasian males got a higher rate of acceptance. But when they asked for something today, because of the time pressure, people actually seem to process stereotypical information less. There's a larger theoretical explanation if you want to read the article, but essentially, under time pressure, you process stereotypical information less, and you're likely to grant requests at about the same rate, regardless of whether the person requesting it is a Caucasian male or not. But what you see is even when you break it down by subgroups, and I realize this is a small font, this is Caucasian females, African American females, and so forth. The light gray bars represent requests for today, or the same day. The black bars represent requests for 5 days in the future. And for every group, except Hispanic females, basically there was a disadvantage if you weren't a white male. So there is this clear, even among academics, there is today there's a slight in-group favoritism bias. Yes.
What is the distribution of the people who respond?
Could you repeat the question so the camera can
Oh,
see it?
yeah. The
Thank you.
question was, what was the distribution? I believe they tried to randomly, it was a stratified sample, so they tried to make sure they had enough people represented from each sector of academia, like engineering was equally represented. I don't know the gender ratio. And they did find that Asians tended to get more responses when they were writing to engineering programs. So there was a program effect. But it's a Psych Science article, and I put a lot of their material online in supplemental material, so there might be a lot of detail there. So we know that stereotypes do have these effects, these 4 primary effects in academia. Another research, though, that's a little more controversial is stereotype accuracy. This is a new area that sort of goes into the biased researcher side of my talk. This is an survey I did recently. It sort of represents a stereotypical stereotype accuracy survey where you ask people to estimate what they think a particular attribute of a particular group is. In this particular place, I was studying attitudes towards race-based and class-based affirmative action. And as part of my survey, I wanted to see whether people could accurately estimate average income for each ethnic group in the US as well as US-wide median income. And what you find is, except for Asians, estimates are pretty accurate. The dark black bars show the accurate figure based on the US Census. And I conducted 3 studies, so each bar after that represents the estimate I got in each study. So they usually be slightly under or over, but if you look at the confidence intervals, they're not that far from accurate. The one effect you do see that's odd is that Asians are underestimated by about $10,000. So this is referred to as a consensual stereotype, where you average across all your respondents, and you create what's called a consensus-based or consensual stereotype, saying that when you average out all the respondents, the average estimate of, let's say, US income is $45,000, whereas the accurate figure is $50,000. If you want to actually compute an accuracy coefficient, there are ways to do that where you measure the bias that actually was observed against the bias that could have occurred. I didn't do that for this study. But there have been many studies in stereotype accuracy over the last 10 years. And most of these have found a pretty strong effect. So,
I have a question.
yes?
So, could you just go back there for a second?
Yeah.
There's been really interesting data. So two questions. Number
Yeah.
one, I mean, it's a naive question, but in what direction or which direction would indicate prejudice in these kinds of data? Number one. There's an example, looks like there's a slight tendency, if I'm reading it correctly, for people to overestimate African American income.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, does that indicate prejudice? I can see an argument that actually can indicate prejudice because you're underestimating the degree of poverty
Right.
in African Americans, or would the opposite indicate prejudice, or is it sort of neutral in terms of valence, in terms of prejudice?
For this study, I would say, absent further data, I would classify it as neutral. The thing about prejudice is it's defined in many different ways, and so the most agreed upon definition now is negative attitudes towards a group. And I think because income is somewhat neutral, it's too vague just looking at income to say whether their attitude towards a group is negative or that's just their estimate based on their experience.
And do you have, in terms of individual differences, do you have any measures of racism or modern racism there to sort of look at whether they predict a degree of
Now, I have measures of social dominance orientation and conservatism in this. They didn't predict it.
They did not, huh?
The only thing that did, I mean, my manuscript is under review. I was particularly interested in the Asian gap and why people capped Asian income and white income. And I was trying to see what predicted that. And the only thing that did, like, gender and race didn't predict it, social dominance orientation and conservatism didn't predict it. Household income didn't predict it. So a number of factors didn't predict it across the 3 studies. The one thing that did predict it was the belief that whites are privileged. So people who tended to believe that whites are privileged believe that no one else surpasses whites, whereas people who didn't they tended to be more accurate. Well, even those people were they were less inaccurate. Very few people were accurate.
Thanks.
Sure. And one of the things we found about social stereotypes in particular, if you look at consensual stereotypes and look at the effect sizes are It's a psychological term to determine the magnitude of the effect you found. Psychological effect sizes tend to be low, so we found a lot of effect sizes in the 0.4 to 0.5 range. A few tend to be higher, a few tend to be lower. And if you look at the leftmost column at the top, there are very few social psychological effect sizes that are found that are over 0.5 in general research across the entire field of social psychology. And if you look at the proportion of consensual stereotype accuracy correlations, you actually find that that's 94% of them exceed 0.5. So stereotype accuracy, at least measured in terms of consensual stereotypes, is one of the strongest effects in social psychology. Personal stereotypes tend to be a bit less accurate. The personal stereotype accuracy refers to whether the stereotype of every individual, how inaccurate the stereotype of every individual is. And the other interesting question that has come out of stereotype accuracy is, do stereotypes actually affect, to a large degree, the way people think? And what's found here is it depends really on what variable you're looking at and what the question is. So the question is, do sex stereotypes bias evaluations of men's and women's work? The average expectancy effect is minus 0.04, which means there is a bias towards men, but it's a very, very small bias as well. And it greatly varies. One of the strongest effects you see here is that if you're a defendant in a mock jury verdict, your attractiveness and your social class work in your favor to a much larger degree than anything else. And the two sets of meta-analyses at the bottom with the somewhat stronger effect sizes are, if you can't read them, do stereotypes bias judgments of targets in the absence of any individuating information? And do stereotypes bias judgments of targets in the presence of individuating information? And the difference here is actually important because in social psychology research, particularly with the implicit association test, you find that no individuating information is presented. And the whole reason people find stereotypes offensive in day-to-day interactions is that people feel like they're presenting individuating information, but it's not being taken into account. And you see that there is, fortunately, a large drop in this effect once individuating information enters the picture. Stereotype accuracy, however, has been controversial. So Lee Jessen, who's written, he's written most of the research on stereotype accuracy. He, in addition to Clark Macaulay, who is at Bryn Mawr, and in his chapter, for several of the books, he talks about how when he was first presenting research on stereotype accuracy, he was accused of purveying quote-unquote nonsense, of living in a world where stereotypes are all accurate and no one ever relies on them anyway, calling for research with titles like "Our Jews are really cheap" and "Our blacks are really lazy," of disagreeing with civil rights laws and providing intellectual cover for bigots. And if you look at the two handbooks that are currently in print about prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination, one of them actually doesn't even contain a chapter on stereotype accuracy. So the one on the left does, the one on the right does not. And so it's an interesting controversy to look into because it in itself constitutes a form of bias. And one way to look at this is to see, well, if stereotype accuracy, well, if combating stereotypes is a liberal cause, then stereotype accuracy can be seen as a conservative cause. And if there's liberal bias in academia, that means there's suppression of stereotype accuracy research. And Inbar and Lammers, who were two Dutch psychologists at Tilburg University, conducted a very large survey study. It was a convenient sample of social psychologists in 2012 to see if there was a willingness to discriminate against conservatives among social psychology authors. And what they found, these don't show the correlations, just the means, but in pretty much any kind of review, there was a willingness to, a small to moderate willingness to discriminate against conservatives solely because they were conservative. So the scales here are measured on 1 to 7, where 1 is not at all and 7 is very much. So none of them surpassed 4, which was somewhat. The correlation that they found was that the more liberal you were, the more you were willing to discriminate against conservatives in these types of proposals. And this research actually stemmed from a presentation that Jonathan Haidt, who does research on moral psychology, presented at the Society of Personality and Social Psychology Research in 2011, which actually spurred a lot of conversation. And here he was talking about bias formed by people forming groups with sacred values, sort of the essence of in-group identity theory, which is that groups tend to form and have identities. A corollary is that in the real world, groups also develop sacred tribal values around morals or around objects that they tend to make the center of their lives. And something is sacred, when something is sacred, it's non-negotiable. It's not something that can be traded for something else. It's just inherently sacred. Tetlock defines a sacred value as any value that a moral community implicitly or explicitly treats as possessing infinite or transcendental significance. And sacred values actually cause polarization of the way we view things. So if you look at the controversy around evolution and Darwin's theory of evolution and fundamentalist Christianity, you see that there's this duality, sort of two magnetic poles, where God and anything associated with God is held sacred, and anything opposite that is associated with Satan. And the Bible, by its very nature, is associated with God, so anything that contradicts the Bible is associated with Satan. And I took the animation out of this. If you watch the original, this is from Jonathan Haidt's talk. If you watch the original talk, which is available on edge.org, you'll see the animated version. But essentially, like magnetic poles, anything that's opposite to one of your sacred values gets pulled to the other pole. So in this case, because the theory of Darwin contradicts the Bible, even though it's inherently not anti-religious, it gets perceived as being pulled, well, it gets pulled toward that pole within the tribe itself, and it gets perceived as anti-religious or anti-God. And it's easy for people who are outside the fundamentalist community to see this, because it's a group outside, and so you're looking at them from the outside. What's harder to see is when it happens within academia itself. In social research in academia, you find the same thing occurring from time to time, though. So if you look at the history of civil rights, in the 60s and 70s, there was this basic, very clear duality. People like Martin Luther King Jr., who were fighting for equal rights, and then people like the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists, who were on the opposite end. And one of the things that happened during the 1970s was Patrick Moynihan, who was in Washington, a senator, wrote the Moynihan Report, which was a big deal back then about why black poverty was so persistent in inner cities. And part of his larger theory was that racism, decades of racism, had caused a tangle of, what he called a tangle of pathology, resulting in a culture of poverty. And what happened as a result of that was it seemed like he was saying that blacks themselves were to blame, even though he was actually clearly blaming this on racism. And that caused his ideas to go towards the other pole, and he was shunned by people. And you often see this happening in academia because of this polarization where everything either has to be classified as belonging to the good pole or the bad pole in civil rights or issues of equality or egalitarianism. I'm giving you a very abbreviated version of the Haidt talk, so if you have time to see it, I definitely recommend watching the whole talk. And one of the things Jonathan Haidt pointed out about his own experience, he pulled out this coming out narrative from 1985 from a student. Until about a year ago, I was very quiet about my sexual orientation. I often didn't understand the sexual jokes made by my colleagues. The people making the jokes thought that we all felt the same way, and I certainly wasn't going to reveal that I disagreed. That would have been much too awkward. JB was really the first person I talked to about my sexual identity. He made me feel more comfortable and seemed to want to hear other perspectives. Since then, taking PT's class opened a dialogue, and others have shared more as well. Before, I thought that I was completely alone and was afraid to say much because of it. Now I feel both somewhat obligated to speak up. I don't want others to feel as alone as I did, and I also know that I have more support than I originally realized. And this sounds like a familiar coming out narrative from 1985. This was actually an email that Jonathan Haidt himself received in 2011. He changed every instance of political opinions to sexual orientation. This is the email he actually received. Until about a year ago, I was very quiet about my political opinions. I often didn't understand the political jokes made by my colleagues and so forth. So it was a very similar experience coming from the student. And I think one reason, well, there are a couple of reasons that there's this bias against what appear to be anti-liberal values in the social sciences and academia. And some of it has to do with cognition. We tend to be embodied in our cognition. So when we assign blame to things, we feel like something evil, if evil is to blame for a social ill, then there's a fixed amount of stuff there, and evil has to be responsible to all of it. So if you explain it through other factors, like genetic selection or evolution or geography, the more you have of that, the less of the pie ends up being blamed on just evil itself, whether you call that racism or sexism or any other kind of form of discrimination. And this is actually a levels of analysis issue where if you're analyzing something at the moral plane versus at the scientific plane, evil actually exists at a different level, but if you have the illusion that they're at the same level, it seems like this problem occurs, and so it's harder to do research in these areas, and it's often seen as conservative to do research on why racial disparities or gender disparities might have been caused by cultural evolution or genetic selection. And so one of the biases we now see in academia is it's harder to study these topics without blaming disparities on racism. And another issue, there's sort of these theories of sacred groups. We sort of know that in the 19th century, this comes from an anthropologist named Keenan Malik, his research on racial purity showing that we had the sort of idea that races were pure and we had to maintain the purity, and there was a hierarchy of them with Western Europeans at the top and Native Americans and Africans at the bottom. What gradually happened in the 20th century is that we sort of got this UNESCO model where all cultures are equal, but cultural purity still had to be maintained. And then there was the colonial guilt model, which sort of shifted that, where we felt that because of colonial guilt, the hierarchy was tilted, and Europeans owed obligations to other cultures, and the purity of everything still had to be maintained. So for one reason, an example of that now is when you look at, let's say, a McDonald's opening in a foreign country that's never had a McDonald's, you view that as a violation of the purity of that culture. But if a restaurant from, say, Africa would open in America, you don't. And again, because of this theory of cultural purity, there's a lot of stress in academia about how you explain cultures. So there are also favored and disfavored theories, and this is the more biased part of our talk in terms of ideology as a whole. Theories that tend to be favored in the social sciences are social constructionism, egalitarianism, and self-determination. And sometimes favoring these theories in a roundabout way can disfavor actual egalitarianism. What's actually disfavored are things like social realism, the idea that we're viewing the world accurately and not through stereotypes, blaming the victim, inherent differences, stereotype accuracy itself, and nativism, the idea that we might be born with certain tendencies as opposed to just having learned tendencies. And what we now know is because of the speed of evolution, we used to think that inherent differences were unlikely, but we now do know that there are some inherent differences because evolution has sped up rather than slowed down in the last 10,000 years. The conventional view was that it had slowed down, but if you look at the graph on the left, you see that the last 10,000 years have been the period when there's been the widest level of allele variation. So there are likely to be differences between microregions of the world. And this doesn't mean that a theory of races is correct. It means that a theory of looking at the world as consisting of hundreds of very small regions with unique selection pressures and unique diseases might be appropriate. One area in particular is there's a new book out called The Sports Gene. You might have seen it reviewed or talked about on NPR. It's a theory that different parts of Africa, West Africa and East Africa in particular, have different selection pressures because of high altitudes versus malaria, which led to one set of people being a little more adapted towards long distance and one towards sprinting. And this doesn't mean that the average person in either of those areas is a good sprinter or a long distance runner. What it means is the distribution is wider. In sex differences as well, one of the things we now know because of genetic analysis is that women and men did not have equal access to mating throughout human history. About 80% of the women who have ever lived have had children, but only about 40% of the men that have ever lived have had children that have had descendants that have lived today. So mate competition for males and females there were different strategies that were effective. And one of the strategies that seemed to be effective for males was trying to be outstanding through deviance, through being far away from the norm, by taking high risks. And the result of that is men tend to have a higher standard deviation on lots and lots of traits, even though the means are exactly the same. And a result of not looking at that standard deviation can mean if you only look at the top tail, men seem to be overrepresented. If you look at the overall distribution, you realize that men are overrepresented on both ends. But another larger bias in terms of applying our stereotype research to academia itself is thinking about whether we evaluate evidence of stereotypes and discrimination fairly. And so there is an issue of statistical neglect where we don't necessarily view statistical evidence in the way we should view it, and it gets oversimplified. Two physicists in particular, Susan White and Rachel Ivey, recently looked at evidence of whether women were underrepresented in physics faculty in academia. There were a lot of comments being made about how in small undergraduate departments there were many, many departments that had no women in the department at all. And this was used as evidence of discrimination against women. And they ran a probabilistic simulation, given that physics as a whole, the faculty is about 17 or 19% female. And they found that purely based on random distributions, it was likely just based on chance that you end up with a lot of small departments that have no women. What they were not saying was that there's no discrimination. What they were saying is that once you inherently have a small number of people within a field, purely by random chance, sometimes you end up with departments that are all male, even in the absence of discrimination. So there does tend to be things like numbers without context and base rate neglect. There also tends to be a little more emphasis on awareness-raising campaigns, but a few panic-diminishing campaigns. And I feel like this is a matter of stereotyping as well. We sometimes stereotype because prejudices as a whole are prevalent at an average rate. We may evaluate every department within a university as being prejudiced, as opposed to looking at every department as a unique department with its own culture. So there's also this overvaluing of autonomy, where we try to instill a value of autonomy, and that itself is problematic if we try to diminish stereotyping altogether and say, you're an autonomous individual and you really make your own choices, because one of the things we know through the whole science of sociology is that societies and institutions tend to have a homogenizing effect on the people within them. So if you are an Emory student, Emory as an institution has had a somewhat homogenizing effect on you, even though you may not have realized it. If you live in the state of Georgia or if you live in the city of Atlanta, that has had a homogenizing effect on you, and you're similar to other people who live in the city and the state. And so at least regional stereotypes and institutional stereotypes do tend to be accurate, and it's difficult to know how we need to take that into account, but we do know that social forces do have this homogenizing effect. But the larger question is, what answers do we have for combating invidious stereotyping, which is what we're trying to combat, and prejudice as a whole, which is what we're trying to combat. And so I apologize for the small font, but this is an analysis of all the strategies people have used or tried out through social psychological experimentation in the last 10 or 15 years. There was an article published this year in Social and Personality Psychology Compass. And it compared various strategies, and the most effective strategy seems to be shifting group boundaries through competition, through vivid countertypical scenarios, and if you're dealing with the implicit association test in particular, practicing an implicit association test with counter-stereotypical exemplars. So what the top strategy is shifting group boundaries. That involves actually thinking of groups not divided along racial lines or around gender lines, but around other lines that make sense. So if you think of your university as competing against another university, or your research lab competing against another research lab, all of a sudden those lines become prominent. And obviously that's not a perfect strategy, because then you're creating other kinds of competition. But it's good that we now have this research on what's effective and what's not. For example, we know that perspective taking per se doesn't really seem to have much of an effect at all. Another question is, what trade-offs do we have? John DeVideo who's been researching prejudice and stereotyping for about 40 years, has published hundreds of articles on this. I recommend watching his talk. He's found that there is this fundamental trade-off where if you diminish people's attention to group boundaries, people feel included, but then if they've been disadvantaged, people tend to neglect that. On the other hand, if you draw attention to group boundaries and you say this group over there has been divided from us and they've been disadvantaged as a group, then you're also drawing attention to the boundary, which means they feel less included. And thus far, we don't know of a way to simultaneously achieve both goals at the same time. So I think one of the biggest challenges we have is to figure out for our institution or for our department what is the most appropriate thing. Do people feel like they're being excluded, or do people feel like they're being deprived of resources? And that may vary from place to place. When I moved to the US as an international student, I definitely felt like the institution I was at didn't have any problems regarding distribution of resources. I just felt excluded as an international student. But that may vary from department to department and university to university. So I think one of the biggest challenges is just realizing that we have this trade-off, and we need to figure out maybe what's most appropriate for our university at this time. So in conclusion, the title of my talk was, do we have biased people or biased researchers? And I think we have a little bit of both. But we also have this trade-off where we can't achieve everything we want all at the same time. And the challenge for us is not only to look at all the research out there on how people develop biases and why people develop them, but what we can do about them and figure out, rather than stereotyping our whole institution and having one common problem, looking at individual cases or departmental cases and thinking about what's going on in each of those cases. Because viewing the whole institution with one, or painting the whole institution with one wide brush is also a form of stereotyping. Thank you. Any questions?
I have.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious, a lot of what we talked about was, it almost seemed like ways that institutions or people who are stereotyping
Yeah.
could change that or work on it. Is there any way that, I mean, like, I guess the best example is like if you're primed to have this like negative, and I'm probably using the wrong terminology, so I apologize, but if you're sitting down to take a test and you have one of these negative stereotypes that applies to you and that's primed, is there anything you can do to counteract that instead of waiting for someone else to say, oh, we should change how we do the test? If you're like, I am awesome at math and I'm going to rock this, would that, I guess, sort of undo any bias of, oh, you know, it asked me if I'm a female, this is a math test, I might not do as well.
Yeah, there's been some research in that area, and so one of the strategies is actually just knowing that stereotype threat is an effect. So knowing the psychology of stereotype threat allows you to sort of mentally accommodate for the fact that some of your stress is not being caused by the test, it's not being caused by the stereotype in and of itself, it's just being caused by this tendency. And once you know that's occurring, then you can sort of segment that and say, okay, I can stop. Well, some of the anxiety seems to go away. I think there are a couple of other strategies that have been developed as well. I'm not entirely sure what they are. But I know that's an effective one. And people have tried, because there's so much research on it, people have tried to see if it has been disseminated. A lot of undergraduates don't actually know about stereotype threat. So that's an issue. Yes?
Enjoyed your talk a lot, by the way.
Thank you.
It's very provocative. So I have a kind of a wonky technical question.
Yeah.
That may seem kind of boring, but it sort of to do with my interpretation of the stereotype accuracy work, which I don't know all that well. I know a bit of just Justin's work. Obviously controversial. People won't really let him talk at conferences sometimes. But in that work, I know you presented Pearson correlations.
Right.
Which are not typically, are not sensitive to the absolute level of scores. So you can get a correlation of 1.0 even though the absolute scores are really different. So in this work, do you know what kinds of correlational metrics people look at? Because what concerns me a little bit about reliance on Pearson correlations rather than interclass correlations, to get a little technical, is that you could still get people who are really stereotyping a lot because they're either the threshold is really way high or really low, but the Pearson correlation still would be very high, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I know that there's a division, so some people use discrepancy scores, and some people use correlations. I don't know if he somehow tried to convert the effect sizes from those who use discrepancy scores into some kind of metric that makes it comparable. That might be what he's done. I mean, you could email him actually.
Yeah. So
What he's done there. I mean, there are as with anything, there are potentially an infinite number of ways to model accuracy because there's no one perfect way to do it. I mean, one way I've done it is actually see if clustering occurs in a pattern you would expect too. In my income research, I tried to see if people, even though they underestimated Asian income, I tried to see if they correctly they clustered Asians and whites as a high factor group, as a high income one factor group, and blacks and Hispanics as a lower income single factor group. And they did in fact do that. So there was, even though there was sort of the inaccuracy for Asian perception in terms of the absolute bar, there was accuracy in the sense that they were placed in this higher income cluster. So you can find paradoxical results. It's true. It would be nice if data just gave us one clear story regardless of how we analyze it. That doesn't happen. Yes?
I was intrigued by your slide about 80% coming from women and 40% from men. I don't understand what relevance it has to the subject and how the data were arrived at.
The data were arrived at through DNA analysis.
Sorry?
Through DNA analysis.
Give me an idea, what DNA, mitochondrial DNA, why? What exactly was done?
Because I'm not a DNA expert, I don't know the exact details, but Roy Baumeister's book, What Are Men Good For?
What are they trying to tell us?
Well, what they're trying to tell us is because if there's unequal access to mates, and you have to develop, men develop a different strategy for mate attraction than women do, that might be a way of accommodating for the fact that there's unequal access to mates. And so one way to get higher access to mates is to do something that's high risk, to stand out. And so being high risk means deviating either in a positive or negative direction from the mean. So simply deviating itself might be an evolutionary stable strategy for males as opposed to females. There's probably more mathematical wonkiness to it that I can't describe because I don't know it myself. But the fundamental idea is if for males, a better strategy is more deviance, then you find more deviance. You'll find more deviance.
I'd love to get the reference.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense to me how they arrived at this and what it means. But do you have a reference?
Yeah, Roy Baumeister's book.
Sorry? Well, I can get
Yeah.
it later.
Well, here's Roy Baumeister. He's a social psychologist at Florida State University. He does both sociology and psychology, and all of his books are really fascinating. His book is called "Is There Anything Good About Men?" It's from 2010. I can write it down for you after the talk.
Yeah, well, if you leave it on for a moment.
Okay.
But I still don't understand the relevance. I'm sorry, I'm dumb or something, but I'm interested in human populations and genetics. And I don't see how they can put in all the founder problems of humanity and the different homos and the homo sapiens, etc. How they can have enough numbers to come out with this conclusion. But I'll look at the data, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're looking just at Homo sapiens. Yes?
It's likely an estimate based on diversity in current populations because the number of mutations is assumed to accumulate at a relatively steady
Yeah,
rate.
but which humans? The African humans or the Asian humans? Or which humans are they talking about?
Yeah, I don't know how
Is
far
this
it went back.
From the beginning of Eve and
Yeah, Roy Baumeister's book, I mean, if you look up the citation, that's probably the best way to figure out.
right.
It
to what they
depends how
did.
many years it goes back.
It doesn't have to go back. All you've got to do is have samples of all the
Sorry?
population. It doesn't have to go back. All you have to do is have samples of the relevant populations all around the world, and they do have that now with regard to samples of people's DNA. And I take it that, I would guess the finding is that you just have a lot more variation in mitochondrial DNA than you have in Y chromosomes,
Probably.
is what they're finding.
Is there anything good about men? So what's the conclusion?
You'll have to read the book to figure out how to.
No, he's
I can't
asking
spoil the end of the book for you.
I mean, just because our Y chromosome is getting smaller and smaller with evolution,
Well,
doesn't
the,
mean
I
that
mean, the book is
we're
about.
not important.
The book is about social structures that because men, because it's an evolutionary strategy for men to be deviant, men are then pushed into high risk occupations. So some of them end up being highly rewarding as well, in addition to being high risk. And this is based on social structures, not just genetics. And some of them get pushed into very high risk but low reward populations. So military generals and military soldiers, the rewards are unequally distributed, and they're more at the top and at the bottom. I mean, if you look at income distributions, most CEOs are men, most homeless people are also men. So there tends to be this cultural pushing of people pushing men into the extremes through social structures. That's what the book is largely about. Yes?
I have a question about your own study.
Yeah.
Did you try to discern whether or not the subgroups that you were looking at were evaluating their own subgroup and how variant that was?
Yeah, I did. I used dummy coding to figure out if people who were whites, well, I only had a really large sample of whites, so the white versus non-white effect, and there wasn't much of an effect there.
Chris, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Could you repeat it just so the camera can catch the question? It might
Oh
have been
yeah, the
misunderstood.
question was, when I did my own study on incomes, did I test whether people who were, respondents who were white, estimated incomes differently from respondents who were black versus respondents who were Asian? Whether own race estimations were accurate. That didn't seem to predict much of anything.
But your sample size didn't include large African American.
Yeah, it was, well, for each study it was about 150 to 200 people. It was about 4 to 5% black and 4 to 5%, well, about 7% Asian. So not a huge sample of non-whites. Yes?
I was wondering, so you talked a little bit about liberal bias in academic research, and just a general question. I mean, what do you think is do you think that presents any problems for our understanding of science and social science, if any, and what can be done to correct that if that's the case?
I think it tends to produce, oh, should I repeat the question?
Thank you.
The question is, regarding liberal bias in academia, does it affect our scientific research in any way? And
Or
what do we-
our understanding of the
our understanding of, and what can we do about it? In terms of understanding, essentially every community tends to have sacred values, and sacred values lead to taboos. And so in theory, science should explore every possible hypothesis, or every reasonably plausible hypothesis. In practice, if a hypothesis breaks a taboo, it tends to be discouraged. And this is not a problem that we can totally surmount, because we'll always have some values, which means we'll always have some taboos. So there will always be some hypotheses that are offensive. But if you tend to have a smaller community, well, a homogenous community, just say liberals or just conservatives, then no one is there to break the taboos at all. Whereas if you have, let's say, liberals and conservatives equally represented, then liberals will conduct experiments that break conservative taboos, and conservatives might run experiments that break liberal taboos. In terms of what we can do about it, one thing, if you think back to the email, is just creating a less hostile atmosphere. I mean, sometimes it's just sort of implied that everyone in your department is liberal, so you make a joke about Mitt Romney or something. And it seems funny, but if like one of the people in your department is actually a closeted conservative, and they're angry about it, but they feel like they have to do that to maintain their career, you're creating an even more hostile atmosphere by cracking jokes about Mitt Romney. So that's one thing we can do. I don't know what else we can really do. But as I said, it's also sort of that there'll always be some taboos, and that's just a factor in science. They'll change from century to century, from generation to generation. So in some senses, it's self-correcting.
I have a follow-up question
Yeah.
to that. So I feel like a lot of times in academia, it's very taboo to be biased, which is, I think it's
Yeah.
universally seen as a bad thing. But I know a lot of times people have, I think a lot of the work that you showed that people have implicit biases, or even they're biased, but it's maybe a good stereotype. So how do you think it goes over telling people, like, you're trying not to be biased, but you still might be? Like, is that a taboo to tell people who are trying not to be biased that they still could be?
Well, it depends on the domain. Should I repeat the question, or did I?
I think I'm close enough.
Okay.
It was all right.
It depends on the domain. So in America, in particular, because of the civil rights movement involving race and because of feminism, race and gender are more sensitive issues. So those are more uncomfortable to bring up, I think, if you notice someone being biased. But not so uncomfortable that people don't bring them up. It's probably easier to tell someone that they seem to be biased towards accepting students from the Midwest, or something that's less controversial. In general, it's better to bring it up than not bring it up. That's what the research seems to show. If you bring it up, people will tend to try to correct themselves. But it's also a confrontation, which is difficult. But in general, people encourage mentioning with someone if they seem biased. In general, people make very few explicit biased comments. So a lot of social psychology experiments have people chatting with this fictitious confederate, and they say something overtly racist or sexist. And it's an interesting experimental manipulation, but it hardly, at least in my experience, it hardly ever happens. So the larger question is, how do you analyze institutional data and say, well, if people from this race and this race have equal test scores, but we're accepting more people from this race, like, how do we confront this, and what do we do? And that ends up being more like, well, what are we doing as an institution? And that's probably varies from department to department. 5 minutes left. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes?
Just I don't know if this practice has continued. I suspect it has, but there was this attention given to the fact that I believe it was in California State Universities, both the University of California, I think in the University of California system actually, that there was actually I don't know what to say, sort of, it was discrimination against Asians because they were overrepresented. Any thoughts about how that gets processed and how people manage that? Sort of.
So, yeah, I'm familiar with that. So Caltech is, I think, the only prestigious university in the country to only accept people based on SAT scores. And if you look at their admissions, the percentage of Asians has just steadily gone up. If you look at other universities, there was a point at which they stopped releasing statistics on how many Asian applications they were rejecting. And sort of at more or less the same point, the Asian percentage flattened out. So if you see this Caltech versus everyone else effect, it seems like at that point people sort of decided, okay, we just need to count the number of Asians because they're overrepresented by a factor of 5. Now we just need to stop, even though they're really qualified. And so that's what educational researchers have surmised is going on. But because the universities are hiding the statistics, we don't know for sure.
And this was at Harvard and MIT also, if I remember.
Yeah. So universities like that. So it's one of those situations where you're surmising based on what another university has done. It definitely seems like people are no longer explicitly adding or subtracting points to someone's application, but there are these cultures that develop within the admissions office of applying harder standards to Asians so that the percentage of Asians gets capped. So the the qualitative evidence seems to show that there's sort of these little cultural signals that people in admissions offices give to their employees to say, maybe use slightly harder standards for agents when you're evaluating them.
The same thing's gonna, or people have speculated that the same thing may happen between the genders as more and more women end up going to college.
Yeah, that probably is happening right now already.
Probably happened here, actually.
Yes. Yes?
I was just wondering, do you know anything or have any thoughts about like how biases are perceived, or what makes certain biases like what makes them be perceived extremely negatively? Like for example, you know, in this modern age, we consider like biases based on race and on gender and things like and sexual orientation and things like that to be largely negative. You know, we would like to not have biases based on those things, but you know, but then other things like, you know, maybe I don't know, attractiveness or height or something. A lot of it, you know, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any studies that examine the role of like, you know, height in attaining like, you know, academic power or something, or like, you know, like whether we should have affirmative action for short people or something. I don't know, but like, do you have any thoughts on what makes certain biases acceptable, whereas other biases are not?
I don't know of any explicit research. That is an interesting topic. We have biases about what biases are worth commenting. So there's a second order bias effect. I mean, bias research does tend to be driven by political movements, and there hasn't been a political movement by less attractive people to be more represented, for example. That they don't tend to cluster together the way races cluster together, the way gender sometimes cluster together. So that kind of movement may never occur. If the political movement doesn't occur, it might be less likely for some kind of academic research area to be spurred into action. But that's just a very random guess on my part. I do know once an area of research develops, it tends to be self-sustaining because you become a professor and then your advisees tend to study what you study, and it becomes a hot area. So if you want to get cited, you do research and you just continue doing research in that area. So once an academic area is established, it does tend to self-sustain that way. But I mean, it is changing. The latest, the Handbook of Prejudice, Discrimination, and Stereotyping, the Nelson one, the one with the red cover, that not only has chapters on racism and sexism, but has a chapter on sexual orientation and anti-fat prejudice. And Susan Fisk, who's one of the biggest names, is now doing a lot of research on aging, prejudices related to aging, and how we have prescriptive stereotypes for the elderly. We sort of prescribe that they take fewer resources, that their job, so to speak, is to just go away and not take our resources, which is unfortunate, but we do have that stereotype. So I should probably wrap up, but thank you all for your time and attention.